Good morning again. Welcome to Unlocking the Financial Sustainability of SMEs to Achieve SDG 6. It's a very challenging title, I would say. We'll ask our speakers to tell us about how they see the situation. My name is Carolina Latorre. I'm Senior Program Manager at the Waste Foundation. Very pleased to be here with you. And I will walk you through what we have for you prepared. We will have a very interesting keynote speaker. We're really looking forward to hear from Martin Gisler. He's Senior Water Advisor in the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then we'll have a panel discussion that we have structured in two parts. The first one will be looking at today's situation. What is like to be an entrepreneur, and what's the journey towards that holy grail called creditworthiness we've been talking about throughout the week? And where are the challenges, specifically from investors from different perspectives as well, and from the different actors that we think need to play a role, but maybe we will discover there's others today too. In the second part, we'll bring you to what's next. So how do we scale up from current levels of service and investments towards the trillions that we've been talking about during this week? And we have some learning objectives, so we hope you learn from the journey of the entrepreneurs and understand the investors' challenges, and as well looking at the different financial tools are there, what the opportunities are, and what's the role of the different actors, but how all together we can bring today to those goals we've been talking about and yearning for. So without further ado, I would like to invite our keynote speaker to join me here on stage. Martin, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm not even a finance expert. So there's not enough public sector financing to deliver the water-related SDGs. So let's get the private sector in. I hear there's $200+ trillion of dollars piled up with asset managers that seeks a financial return. But so far, very little of that has flown into the water sector. And even less to the unserved for whom we try to, advance SDG 6. So it's marginal for now in most low-income countries, and the aim is to make it big. So that requires a major transition, or probably actually a whole number of parallel transitions, to get from the millions to the billions, and I think I now have to add the trillions because the ambition is even higher. So how realistic is that transition? I mean, one thing that I've learned from many years in Africa is that poverty is really unaffordable. It's really extremely expensive to be poor. That's why it's so hard to get out. And so what I'm asking myself is, if elevating the poor out of poverty would be a real money-making business, I guess poverty would have been solved a long time ago. So how does this private sector finance help us? Let's unpack that in the next couple of minutes. So I'm not a finance expert. We do grant financing in low-income countries, mostly in Africa and the Middle East. But we don't expect a financial return. In fact, we provide the cheapest money on earth. It's completely free. So, being expert in the cheapest money on earth, I'm now going to talk about very expensive money. So, there's finance and there's payment. So finance requires a return, so somebody has to pay it. And when there's higher risk, there's a higher premium on that finance. And maybe where my relevance comes in is that probably the success in using that private expensive finance in the best possible way also depends very much on how the cheap finance is allocated. So bear with me. I think it's useful to distinguish different purposes for which private financing can be mobilized. I mean, there's the public infrastructure and services for water and sanitation and water resources management. I guess there's the delivery of water-related services by SMEs. We'll hear a lot about that today. I will not say much about it. And then there's also the interesting thing that is financing to mitigate the costs that the private sector externalizes, the pollution, depletion, degradation of water resources that are now put on the public balance sheet. And what if those costs would be internalized? Maybe there's quite some not so expensive financing to be mobilized there, but it all depends on the enabling environment that you need for that. So I will share some thoughts about the public infrastructure and scope for private financing and something about the last. So in 2003, we had the Come Dessus report, and it also had this conversation 20 years ago, 20 years on. You know, there's indeed a lot of private finance, but it only will be mobilized if the enabling environment is right. And governments have to get their act together there with policies, institutions, and regulations to steer the cheap finance away from those who can actually afford more expensive finance and to allocate the cheap finance to those who cannot. To better balance the allocation of finance for new infrastructure and for operation and maintenance, because a lot of the investments are not very efficient. Build, neglect, rebuild. And then also the public finance that is available in many developing countries is not really spent. Public expenditure reviews by the World Bank show that of the public water budgets, on average, 72% gets spent and 28% flows back into the treasury. So why would you mobilize expensive private sector finance if the public finance is not even, the cheap finance is not even spent? Now such shifts, I see water utilities sometimes as subsidy machines, and subsidy machines to those who don't need it, because usually it's the higher income groups that are connected, and redressing those mistargeted subsidies is a politically very difficult task. The Global Commission on the Economics of Water, they'll have a session at 2 this afternoon. We'll speak about this as well. So the provocative point I'll make is I think the scope for private sector finance in public infrastructure is limited, but I have an example actually from the Netherlands that may illustrate my point. So we have water boards in the Netherlands. They make sure that there's clean water and that the dikes are maintained and cities don't flood. And they have an enormous revenue. 98% of the people in the Netherlands pay their water board tax. So, you know, the sky is almost the limit. And so most of their operations they finance from their income, but sometimes they need debt financing. And then they have the water board bank. It's a AAA rated bank. It's like the World Bank, access to the cheapest finance. And that bank issues bonds, and it's private finance that comes in from pension funds, and that then gets on lent to the water boards. So that is a mechanism that provides very cheap private sector finance. So you would say, so that's fantastic, the Netherlands have their house in order, but the water boards are highly indebted. They have 200 to 500% debt. That is the range of their annual turnover. So that is real distress. We have climate adaptation investments ahead, so that stress. Now this is based on finance that is available at a 1-2% interest rate. So if the regulatory environment is in place, everybody pays their bills, and you have still sort of debt distress. So what would happen if you would push public water infrastructure and services to private sector finance in developing countries? I mean, that would rapidly spiral out of control with 50% collection of rates, with 20% interest rates, say. I think there's not so much scope for that, other than through instruments like the MDBs. They are somewhat like this water board bank. They can issue bonds and they can lend on for 1-2%. So that's where I see scope for private finance. And the risk, of course, is, so these water board banks, they could continue to lend to the water boards, but then at some point their AAA status will be at risk, and then all finance will become more expensive, and that's also a problem for the World Bank. Yeah? So how much more can they lend without endangering their AAA status? Now let me say a few words about this other thing. The private finance from the private sector for the mitigation of their own water footprint, say. To address the pollution, the depletion of water bodies, the degradation of wetlands. Private finance for better water stewardship, so preventative rather than curative. That should be much more efficient. Now there are sectors like mining, apparel, food and beverage that have quite a footprint. And one of the initiatives that the Dutch government financed, the Value Water Initiative, they made assessments of how much costs are actually being externalized. They looked at two sectors, the meat sector and the apparel sector. And I was actually quite surprised at what comes out. So the cost that economic activity puts on the public balance sheet is about, for meat, it's 65% of net adjusted profits. And for apparel, it's 73% for net adjusted profits. And I did some back of the envelope calculations. If you extrapolate that to the global economy, those two sectors put around $170 billion of costs on the public balance sheet per year. And they represent less than 4% of the global economy. So, let's assume that the picture is somewhat the same in other sectors. Then you're talking about trillions in costs that, our economic institutions enable to put on the public balance sheet. So trillions there, and then I think if you add all the water budget in water ministries, it's probably 1 trillion. That is to clean up, say, the shit, and to provide services. So knowing that prevention is always cheaper than curing, we cannot really expect that with 1 trillion, of which maybe 300 million goes to cleaning up the shit, could actually finance several trillions of costs. So there's something wrong there in the rules of our economy. But it's really difficult to change those rules, because as soon as you want to change that. So how would you change it? If companies were to internalize that, then obviously the prices of their products would go up. Now politicians are usually not so interested in enabling that. So that's why I think, this transition from millions to billions to trillions and getting the private sector in, yes, it is possible, but it requires an enormous amount in the enabling environment. And I think that is where a big focus should be. So some final words. So with every transition, there's the question of what does a just transition look like? Social justice, economic efficiency, environmental sustainability. How do you balance them, and how willing are those who now have access to the cheaper finance to say, well, actually we can afford the more expensive finance? We see it in some of our projects where we try to finance, for instance, utilities through more expensive money, and then a fellow donor comes in and says, well, I actually have free money. So then a deal sort of collapses. And so if we really want to make this transformation, things have to happen in the private finance sphere, but also in the public finance sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That's a very good framing for the discussions we're going to have today. I saw some of our speakers nodding, so I think they will have a lot to say on that. And with that, I would like to invite our panelists. Please, Daniel Yin, he's the CEO of Spouts of Water, to join me on stage. Mr. Adamson Sakala, he's technical advisor to the private sector in partnerships from WaterAid. Mr. Kaiten Hetzer, he's director of waste and also of the Take a Stake Fund initiative. Mr. David Berners, he is Global Director, Product Strategy and Investors Relations at Yunus Social Business Funds. Mr. Sinisa Bukic. Sinisa, are you with us?
Yes,
He's Senior
I am.
Portfolio Manager
Hello.
of Actium and Cardano. He's online joining us today. Hi, Sinisa.
Hi, hello.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And Mr. Pereinar Trosten, he's Program Specialist of WASH Department for the International Organizations and Policy Support of CEDA. Welcome, Pereinar. And Martin, I'm going to ask you to join us back again also at the panel. Yes, please. And last but not least, Barbara Schreiner, she's the Executive Director of the Water Integrity Network. Welcome, Barbara. Thank you for joining us too. So today we'll structure the panel in two parts, right? We will talk in this first part about what's happening today. What are the current mechanisms? What's the story? And I would like to start with our entrepreneur in the room. Daniel, thank you for being here with us. Can you tell us, and for those that missed the talk show this week, because we started with you, World Water Week, tell us about your journey towards creditworthiness. Did you get there first?
Yeah. Thanks, Carolina, and thanks for having me. Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel, and I'm the CEO of Spouts. We manufacture and distribute ceramic water filters, very similar to actually the table in the corner, who we manufacture and distribute ceramic water filters in East Africa. So, like in this conference this week, I've been talking a lot about our story because I think it makes us very unique. Our story started in a room smaller than half the room that we're in today. And but it didn't look like this room. It was a chicken farm that we started in. We came from very humble beginnings. So if you want to just imagine, half of the room was basically machines where we slept for about like 3 years, and then the other half of the room was 200 chickens. So that's kind of the environment that we came from. And I always like to mention that because it just shows what level we came from. Very, very humble beginnings. And I've been in Uganda for about 7 years now. And the reason why I mention that is because we're talking about creditworthiness, right? They're not, when you're coming from that type of environment or that type of scenario, there aren't a lot of banks that really line up at the outside of your chicken farm / factory / home trying to give you funding, right? So that was kind of where we started from. And then trying to find like-minded investors, like-minded partners who want to join us on our journey. We came from, I think someone referred to it earlier this week as like a germ. Came from a germ, and now we're becoming this huge organization that's able to provide impact to millions of people. So like organizations like Take a Stake and other like-minded impact investors was very vital to our success that we've seen so far today, but most importantly, what we want to achieve in the future. Our 2030 vision as a company is to reach 6 million households, to reach 35 million people, to reduce carbon emissions by 100 million tons, to employ over 2,500 employees, and then also to have a presence in 6 different African countries. And I would say we're on track to get there. And it all started with like-minded investors, like the ones sitting on this panel with me here today, and very thankful for that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm actually sitting in this chair today.
Thank you.
We are
thank
creditworthy now. Sorry, that was actually the first question.
you are, but but still banks are not lining up there. And what would you say was the most difficult challenge that you had to sort of overcome when talking to investors?
Yeah, so I think the most difficult challenge was basically telling your story, but then also I would say a lot of investors, they have a lot of experience outside of the areas that you're working in. For instance, like I moved to Uganda 7 years ago, been there full time, but my knowledge previous to moving was very little. It was very limited, right? So one is getting that trust of the investor is very, very important, because the organizations on the ground, the SMEs on the ground, they have the knowledge from the local context. And it's not like East Africa is all very similar. Kenya is much different than Uganda. Uganda is much different than Rwanda. We have operations in Uganda and Rwanda, and they're just night and day different. So having that trust with impact investors or just partners in general is extremely important in the success of the organization.
Thank you, Daniel. And with that, I would like to ask Adamson, because we were talking earlier today about these entrepreneurs, the SMEs, right? The whole SME segment, and they have so many challenges, access to capital and so on. You work with them. Does it resonate, the story of Daniel, or is it something you've heard before? Or he is the exception?
Thank you very much. I feel the story of Daniel and Spout is a unique one, in that they saw an opportunity and a challenge that communities were facing and tried to come up with a product that was cost efficient and would sell on the market and grow. Most SMEs that we begin or support do not really have the skills, and some of the circumstances they start in is because maybe an NGO feels there is a service they must provide, and then you select people that you train and say, go into this opportunity. While in the background, those groups that we are training had no passion for that. So beyond the grant, you find that those businesses start collapsing. I think we heard that there is free money, and the challenge of giving free money that we've seen is that it doesn't give the drive for continuity. So maybe the model of how we finance should also start changing, where we disperse funds based on performance. We saw some SMEs under a project that was funded by IFAD in our country under the Enhanced Agribusiness Promotion Project. The disbursement was based on milestones. So they would agree what stages they can get the next funding and such kind of thing. So if you don't reach that milestone, you would not get the funding. So they would push and reach those milestones and get that financing. There was also a component of their own contribution in that. So they would be asked to give a certain amount while the grant gives the match funding. So that way you find that the entrepreneurs who have a drive and they know that they are putting in something, they are not just getting free money. And those are some of the things we need to think about. There is also capacity building. A number of these require that we build capacity towards creditworthiness. So financial processes, the governance issues are required to be dealt with. The business models, so that they can come up with business plans, strategic plans, and start growing through that process. They may start small, but these are the processes that require, that the private sector financiers require at the end of the day. So as we grow them using this free money or grants, we must build their capacity towards creditworthiness so that they can, beyond the grants, start accessing finances. The other challenge that you face with these entities is a lot of inefficiency. This goes even to bigger entities like our commercial utilities. I think the keynote speech brought out those issues. Quite a lot of inefficiencies. You have a business, because they are grant-aided, they get government support, having non-revenue water up to 72%. So if you are in private business and you have inefficiencies to that level, you will be liquidated, definitely. But because there is someone backing you with finances, if you are going to get a loan, the government guarantees the loan. So you have management, you have the board that is not fighting to make sure that that money grows and changes the scenario. They are waiting for another loan that will be given by some commercial financer which government will guarantee. So eventually we have governments that are getting more indebted because they are giving money to people that are not using it efficiently. That goes now also to SMEs that we support at that small level. They are not growing because they depend on that grant that does not ask them to perform. And beyond the grant, they start collapsing. So those are things I think we need to start dealing with. Their scenario, I think, gives a status that they wanted to grow. They had a business plan, they invested, and they started small. So some of the things that I've learned from Spout is that in the beginning, you don't need to get a lot of costs, so you manage your staff, you manage your places where you start from. You may go and rent a business premise in an affluent area and your rentals are high, but they started in a chicken run. So you start in a small environment where you can manage your startup costs. That will help you grow your business.
It can be done, basically. Thank you, Adamson. And I'd like to move now to Cayetan. Cayetan, you work with SMEs, like Spouts, like the ones that Adamson was talking about, with all those challenges. Why you chose to work in such a difficult context and with such a difficult target, and why are they so important?
So it took me actually more than 10 years to get to that point. The time flies when you've got fun. So in my previous life, I was a colleague of Sinisa, now Cardano, back that time, as asset management. And I realized we have to do more with water, also in terms of risk and risk management, but also to do something more proactively, to invest, or to become part of the change maker. So we decided to start with microfinance. So we initiated a microfinance initiative, which is also now scaling successfully. This was supported, thank you very much, by DGIS. And we leveraged so far 1 to 10 to mobilize, especially also local financing from local microfinance institutions to provide affordable and appropriate wash products and services, including to low-income communities. As this also can free up subsidies. So those companies which successfully grow, micro entrepreneurs, came then back to Waste. That, okay, thank you very much for having helped us to facilitate us to having access to funding from MFIs. But now we need 50,000 euro, 100, 500. So we went out, and the MFI said, no, 20,000 really is, that's it. But it then also appeared there was no other out there who was really interested or dedicated seriously to invest in these companies. So we decided to, would not say it's a dirty job, but somebody has to do it, but it's a clean job, somebody has to do it. So a couple of years ago, we initiated this SME initiative. We called it Take a Stake, like chip in, become a stakeholder, not only a shareholder. And this is how I learned also about the SMEs, that they are crucial, not only well-suited to provide also decentralized solutions, complementary to central solutions, but also are well-suited for serving the last mile, low-income communities, but also they've got a lot of other impact. They are crucial also for employment. 50%, sometimes 80% of employment is coming from SMEs. Also better working places very often. Contribution to regional economic growth. Their contribution in terms of GDP is more than 50%. Some numbers show even 80%, so it's enormous. But they are neglected, and especially one particular segment, which is above microfinance, too large, but still too small for the common institutional investors, which is a few million. So if you are between 20,000 and 3 million, or sometimes even more, you are or too small or too large. It's also called officially, as I found out, the missing middle, or small and growing businesses, despite they are the sweet spot of income generation, economic growth, but also very, very promising for helping to close the gap between supply and demand. But they need to be enabled, and this is where we are setting up this initiative. It needs to become a fund, complementary to microfinance, complementary to other initiatives. It's not the magic stick, but it's a huge stick which is required and which is lacking all over. And so to provide the right type of capital, but also along with it, other non-financial support.
Thank you, Kajetan. And you're sitting next to our fund manager. So David, from the perspective of even an impact investor, because that's what you're really looking at, right? That take a stake, the impact you're generating with it too. And that's why you chose this specific missing middle. What are the challenges?
Thank you, first of all. There are still significant challenges. Let's be transparent about that. And from the investor's perspective, I think the primary challenge right now is still that we're looking at a sector which is quite nascent. In terms of deal flow, we do see obviously entrepreneurs, but there's no clear business model champions that have emerged yet. So that means the whole sector and the investors are still learning and figuring out how this sector is to be invested. Nevertheless, we do see a lot of activity in entrepreneurship at the lower level, which calls for what you have said, capacity building for those entrepreneurs. So actually the message is, let's get the Daniels out of the chicken farms and grow them. So that is a major risk or challenge. So we have the luck through our pilot phase in Take a Stake that we have made a lot of learning. So we have figured it out now. And in terms of ticket size, tenure, and all what is then required to grow that business or that sector successfully. So that's number one. Number two, I would say that goes a bit to the public financing side. We do see a lot of subsidized capital in that market still. And that is something which is obviously nice for the entrepreneurs, it grows them, but also to Adam's point, grants and cheap capital need to be used where it is really most needed. You know, that is not to subsidize interest rates in most of the terms, but more to strengthen business models in a long-term financial viability perspective. And that is not always what we see. So there is a challenge there, especially if you come from a commercial investor perspective, because at the end, what you want to do with that initiative here, or what we need to do is mobilize private sector capital. And still, it's just a reality. Private sector capital equates risk and return. So if there's a lot of these cheap subsidized capital out there, de facto as a commercial investor, you will have less of an interest to go in there because you're competing against very cheap capital. So we need to be, as a group or as a sector, more conscious about how we use cheap capital. Now that's needed. I'm totally with you and with everybody, but we need to be more smarter on how we use it. Then I think another challenge that we have is obviously exchange rates. So over the last years, that has become very, very difficult. Recently, it has become very difficult. Knowing that, if you look at the wash sector, we are looking at very localized businesses that have no hard currency revenue streams. That means at the same time, when you lend out, if you want to be impactful, most of the time you need to lend out in local currencies to these companies. At the same time, you as an investor, you're taking that risk on. So there's very little facilities in the world that help you as an investor de-risk that or hedge. And if you have to hedge at a commercial rate, it just becomes financially not viable anymore. So that's where I would wish for public institutions to step up their game there and then help with facilities like this, or for instance, World Banks and institutions like this can play a role. And that leads me to the last challenge, I would say, which is the closeness to the government of these business models today. So that is a good and a bad thing at the same time. We're still looking at private sector initiatives here and SMEs. So that means that at the end, we want them to move as businesses and move efficiently and move rapidly. Sometimes what we see is that due to the nature of the sector itself, which sits somehow on the fence between public and private, we need to be careful on how that slows down also sometimes the process and the agility of these companies. So when policymakers are stepping into the sector, we need to be careful on how they do that to not kill the business flow, or let's say the business dynamics there. And yeah, and lastly, maybe just to add the ticket sizes itself. So as we are looking at a nascent environment which is starting up, I would say, really much, most of the enterprises that we also want to support would still require very patient capital, long-term capital, which is also at smaller ticket sizes. That's where the impactful area is as an impact investor. If you really target impact, you need to be smaller ticket size. So we're talking about ticket sizes going from 400,000 to maybe 750 million. Most of the investors shy away from that because economically it's a difficult thing to operate at these small ticket sizes. So there, I think that's also a call for more cooperation among investors there and share, for instance, due diligences or team up in evaluating these companies and then make it just more efficient to invest. And I would say that's probably what I have to say to that.
Thank you. That's a good list. And with that, I want to go to our online speakers and ask Sinisa, is it possible to invest in Wash and survive?
Well, first of all, good morning to everybody, and I'm very grateful to be with you today. I truly believe it's possible, and we are doing that on Cardano, and maybe just briefly, who is Cardano and who am I? As Kaita mentioned, I've been the colleague of Kaita for a decade, and working in impact management, asset management company, now called Cardano, the Dutch base. We are managing about 30 to 40 billion euros in different kind of assets, and a small piece of that one, a couple of billion, is in impact investing. So predominantly financial inclusion, SME financing, water sanitation is something that we are working on. Now, I'm very glad to hear all these opinions and to talk about this one, because I think that all of you so far reached to the very needed actually actions, because I'm immediately going to the actions, because we are struggling quite a lot. We put institutional money together looking for projects to finance in water and sanitation in particular, and that's challenging in the sense that the business in the water and sanitation is not at such development stage as it should be. Challenging in the sense that the water and sanitation is a human right, and sometimes institutional investors are not willing to take the step. They said this is something that the public money should finance, and there's no actually room for us because usually water is subsidized and is a human right. And the following challenge is basically that institutional money, private investors are looking for commercial-based returns. Now, put this all together, basically it's impossible to provide commercially viable terms on the water and sanitation if you will do that mainstream and straightforward. However, there are the ways, and on Cardano front, we are currently setting up the fund that will invest in water and sanitation in particular, quite sizable for the sector, about 250 million euros will be put in place. But the fund itself is blended. It's actually cooperation between the public money, who is going to help us with the credit enhancement, which is very much needed to bring actually the institutional investors on board, is also very efficient in the sense that we are, exactly as David mentioned, we are cooperating with different parties, one be waste and finish, actually to get synergies and actually to get actually the cost load as low as possible. And also we are trying to get the scale, because with the scale, then there is actually sense to have actually institutional investors in such fund, because small tickets are simply not efficient from the institutional perspective. So all this together, we currently actually build up quite a decent pipeline, and looking actually to start to collaborate with the different parties from Asia to Africa and basically all over the world. Now, where is the main bottleneck is a risk-adjusted return. Can we actually get what we are actually saying that we should be able to provide our investors? Now, from that end, we reached to the certain development funding to provide us credit enhancement, a first loss, if you would like, and to help institutional investors to get enough comfort to step into water and sanitation. And from my experience in the past decade and so, institutional investors are willing to do so. However, the avenues, the ways how to do are very limited. Now we need to cooperate, we need to work together, we need to blend actually our expertise and experience and to put that in the water, because, let alone, and all these trillions and billions, there are millions of people that lack access to the clean water, and that should be our premise and our goal. Of course, we need all to fulfill our fiduciary duties and to get actually returns, but please do mind that there are a lot of people that are having or don't have actually or have limited access to the water and sanitation. So from that perspective, Cardano is actually pulling up these assets with the support of the Dutch government, with the support of the institutional money. Now, all this said, we are not there yet, and this is a very small, we're talking about trillions. This is just a small actually drop in this water issue. However, we are trying to catalyze and to show to the sector and to the actually, in particular to institutional investors, yes, this sector can be investable if we join efforts together and if we act as one front.
And with that, I want to go to Perinar, because Perinar, you are supporting the Take a Stake initiative. So you are doing a little bit of that contribution that Sinisa was talking about. So getting together, public sector, private sector, find something different. I don't want to use the word innovative because I think it's being used a lot. And I want you to walk us through the specifics of this different and why SIDA is interested in doing this.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will give you a little bit background why we are working with you and the history behind it. As you know, SIDA, Swedish SIDA, it's a governmental agency. Our mandate is to work with poverty reduction. And to be honest, our zone of comfort is to handle grants. That's where we came from. But as we all know, the financial needs are enormous, far beyond what ODA can provide. So we have quite recently moved into innovative financing. And when I say quite recently, we're talking about a shift over the last 10 years. So when we're doing this, it's very important that us as a public agency or public sector, we should not disturb the market. That's it's the criteria. Whenever we do something, we should not destroy the markets. And I can just give two examples of tools available. One is challenge funds. The second is guarantees. The SIDA challenge funds, what's that all about? It's to finance entrepreneurs and innovators to contribute to development. And the second, SIDA guarantees, in a nutshell, it's to encourage banks and investors to invest in small businesses. So what are we talking about from a financial point of view? Well, in the end of 2021, the total guaranteed amount of SIDA was 10 billion Swedish crowns. That generated 25 billion Swedish crowns mobilized capital, which in turn made 50 billion SEK available for lendings. So it's a 1-to-5 ratio. And as you said, introducing my intervention here, is that we are involved in Take a Stake. And that's another tool we can use. We can experiment and encourage development of knowledge and test stuff, play around a bit. We can do that if it's justified. And for us, Take a Stake, it's a pilot project, but for us, it's a proof of concept initiative. And it's, from our point of entry, it's a matter to test if it's possible to provide loans for wash companies. And this is, of course, it's a partnership. It's Waste, it's UNOS, it's IKEA Foundation, and it's SIDA. It's a partnership. We are doing this together. We are learning, and we are pooling our brains together. And of course, we are more ambitious than that. Of course, we are thinking about the scaling up potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Perinar, and telling your stories too, to those investors out there so they can see more of Daniels in the world and the stories of those SMEs. And that brings me back to what you were saying earlier, Martin, in your speech, how important is this ecosystem, no? The different actors coming together in a good enabling environment. You have some examples about how important it is, but I was just hearing from Perinar, it took 10 years to come into this financial innovation, right? 10 years just for the financial idea to become something practical. What are the timescales also in that, to get to that enabling environment?
Well, I can top the 10 years. I have a 12-year story. No, I've been involved for the past 12 years in a sort of deep dive in a city in Mozambique, Beira, at the front line of climate change. We started in 2011. And we came there with a water program with Dutch. So we're going to solve water programs in a city that looks a little bit like the Netherlands, at the coast, low, wet. And so we were fishing for water problems, and we put out our rod, and we got fish, and it was not a water problem, so we threw it back and put it out again, and no, this is also not a water problem. Sorry, not going to do that. And after a number of months, we found 1 or 2 water problems, but also we found that everything is so related, and it didn't make a lot of sense to work on resilience if you're just focusing on water. So we started to see the challenge as a piece of as a 1,000-piece puzzle, basically. And our tendency is to, with our project focus, look at the wonderful piece of the puzzle that I have here, and and then we're throwing it somewhere in the urban space, and we're not really thinking about what is the puzzle strategy actually. How do you do that? I mean, usually you start with the corner pieces and the edges, and then you start to fill in the middle, yeah? But we were all the projects in the city are focused on there. So who is the puzzle master in a city? The only legitimate party could be the municipality, yeah? They have the mandate to do that. So we realized that our support is never geared towards how do you do that as a city mayor, as a councillor, as a alderman, as a whole municipal. How do you put these pieces of the puzzle together? So we started to focus on that, and so now 12 years on, we started doing water problems. What we actually achieved was there's a transparent land registry now that is connected to the municipal taxation system. That has now tripled the collection of property tax, for instance, as a really important condition to maintain and operate the infrastructure, because this city is steeped in the build, neglect, rebuild dynamic and syndrome. Unfortunately, in 2019, the big cyclone hit, and it caused about $1 billion of damage. And because we had worked for 7 years on preparing relevant infrastructure investment in the case that would happen. So you could say in a way we were successful, because now $200+ million of infrastructure investment is being prepared. But on day one, the city suffered $1 billion of damage. And maybe in 27, this new infrastructure will come online. So we think we're doing pretty well, but the city is actually, we're not keeping up with the pace of change. And we're not, so we're working on how do you get a revenue system that can operate and maintain that infrastructure. And we're not just working with the public sector, also with private. And I think the point that one of you made, so how do we organize the flow of the cheap money to the more concessional, to the more expensive money? How does this ecosystem work? Really important. And so we work with one private group that SIDA also has supported in a way through REAL. They build cyclone proof homes. There's a builder who builds them, and they've developed a roster of over 1,000 people who are not creditworthy, who have informal income, but they have a lot of cash flow. The banks don't find them creditworthy. They've negotiated for 5 years with the bank, and one mortgage was issued. So then they went to digital bonds. And through digital bonds, they had 30 sort of digitally secured home loans. And these families are now building a 14-month track record. They have almost 100% repayment rate, and they've also already paid, I think, 17% of the principal. And now this builder, they've built 150 homes, part of it with grant funding, some of it with this digitally secured loan. They're now seeking to, okay, we seek an investor, and this is this missing middle. They really have a hard time, finding. I think they have a brilliant system. It's really a sort of financial inclusion innovation using blockchain. Every payment from these unbankable families gets recorded. And after 3 years, they have a track record. And the agreement with the banks now is, after 3 years, we will take them on because we believe them. But these things take an endless amount of time. They're really fascinating, but the clock is ticking.
And we're running out of time.
Yes.
No, that's a bit scary, but you talk about the incentives, you could talk about the rules. Those things take a lot of time. And also, when you don't have that ready, in the meanwhile, there's a lot of risks. And somebody that knows a lot about that is Barbara. So I want to ask you, Barbara, when you bring the private sector and you bring all these actors that are all different working together, which we need, right? There's also risks of failure, about integrity and corruption, and that affects the entire enabling environment because basically what you're trying to build is trust. Can you tell us about that?
Thanks very much, Carolina, and good morning to everybody. It's been very interesting listening to everybody else. Can I just start with kind of setting a little bit of a background around the issue of finance in the water and sanitation sector and some of the challenges before I go on to some of the kind of specific risks and issues that you want me to refer to. And I just wanted to build on some stuff that Martin referred to and that other people have referred to, which is that, we talk about the $114 billion per annum that is required to meet the needs in the water sector. But actually, if we look at the water sector is not bringing in the money that it could bring in. It's not spending the money effectively, and it's not actually spending the money we have. And so, if we look at the whole issue of non-revenue water, non-revenue water is a significant issue in the water sector, and it's undermining the financial viability of a number of institutions. Unfortunately, in many areas, the whole issue of political interference or direct corruption is actually interfering in non-revenue water. We look at the IMF report, which says that generally in the infrastructure sector, which includes water, about 50% of infrastructure money is just wasted due to inefficient management or inappropriate management. And then, as Martin mentioned, the water sector is not spending the money it does have. So budgets are actually being returned at the end of the year. So for me, we start from a position in which we're actually wasting an incredible amount of money that is already available. And in a sense, before we go looking for new sources of finance, we need to be saying, how do we actually improve the use of the financing that we do have, and particularly the public finance? Because as I think it was Sanisa mentioned, we are talking about the delivery of a human right. This is not talking about selling shoes to people. This is about a life and death experience and a human right. And ultimately, I think all of us would actually want our water to be delivered effectively by a responsible public authority. Certainly, that's my sense of where we should be in this game. And I think what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that we are operating in a context of quite often systemic corruption, which permeates the sector. The water sector is very vulnerable to corruption. All of the infrastructure sectors are. and all monopoly sectors are. So water is very vulnerable to corruption. We're also operating in a context of, in developing countries, of relatively low competence or relatively low capacity, let me say rather. And the combination is a fairly dangerous one. And I guess one of my concerns is around the proliferation of delivery. And I think one needs to distinguish here between entrepreneurs who are providing technology into the sector versus those who actually have the responsibility for delivering water to people. Because the delivery of water requires that organization to meet certain requirements in terms of quality, in terms of reliability, in terms of price. The challenge becomes, how does one regulate a large number of small organizations that are providing services to ensure that those services are actually being provided in a way that people are being protected? And I think, you know, there are enormous challenges in developing countries. Many of the regulators are in fact quite weak. I think what we've seen in the UK recently has raised some significant questions around the ability of the regulator, even in an advanced economy, to actually really hold private organizations, private water services providers accountable, and to ensure that they are actually not focusing too much on their profits and are actually focusing on what is their responsibility, which is the delivery of water and the human right to water and sanitation. So I think my concerns around this relate to how corruption interferes with the ability to actually deliver water and sanitation, and how one really holds a range of small organizations accountable and ensures that they are delivering affordable services in the right kind of way. And obviously there are a number of players out there that are doing that. There are also a number of small and medium enterprises that aren't doing that. I mean, to be a little provocative, there are a number of water cartels or water mafia around the world that are private sector enterprises that are providing water and sanitation and are essentially holding communities to ransom in relation to the provision of services. I recently heard that Nairobi water mafia, which I'm sure we're all well aware of, have moved out of the informal settlements and into the formal suburbs, where they're now shutting off the water and forcing people to buy water from them. So there is, for me, a profound question around how one actually assures accountability and how one enables, for example, social accountability in a context where you have multiple providers in multiple contexts. And I think perhaps I will leave it there.
So much, Barbara. And I would like to ask questions from the room now. Probably you are with, yeah, maybe the gentleman there, John. Can you please say your name, introduce yourself, and then to whom is the question?
Louis Borston from the Osprey Foundation. Thank you for the session. This is great. It's wonderful to have so many people involved in this on the panel and so much expertise here. Most of what I'm hearing seems to be about products as opposed to services. And by that I mean we've known for a long time that it's possible to make money selling products into the wash sector. In fact, public sector, large projects and others have used private sector products for a long time. What is often harder to fund are the services, small-scale service providers who are trying to make a living from actually providing the services. Yes, you can microfinance, water.org and others have shown that you can use microfinance to help people have access. So I'm wondering if the panel would talk about what it's like to try to finance service providers as opposed to those who are manufacturing products.
Thank you. Who would like to, Kaiden? You. Mark.
And John, since you have got the microphone in your hand, be ready to add to it. So we are not biased. So we are looking for impact and also investability. And indeed, a product is a more easy one to find. But when we are looking along the sanitation value, supply and value chain, for example, this is also where we are looking into, you could maybe argue that construction of a toilet is a service. Then the emptying of the pit, the transportation, the safe storage, and preferably, and this is what we're advocating, is also the reuse to work towards circular economy. So along the service chain, at the end, could be a product, which is also good. So this way, closing the loop. So these are some examples. The sanitation sector is huge and much more to be done, also in terms of services. And as we all know, sanitation is lagging behind. Maybe not necessarily the low-hanging fruit, but it's a huge fruit we are also looking for. So services from our side certainly is on the map. And if it's lagging behind, this is also where our pre-investment capacity building could come in, but preferably together with other stakeholders to help to beef that up and to get it on the agenda, but also from the perspective of take a stake as one of the players, also to make it investable.
Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I would like to hear from the panelists in terms of the private sector, a local private sector within the country vis-a-vis an international investor or a private company coming into a particular country to invest and develop a water sanitation program there, considering the challenges, for example, the forex rates and all that, how that can contribute in reducing such challenges. Thank you.
Yeah. Who would like to answer first? David, please.
Good. Thank you. Very relevant question. I'll give a very short answer. We'd like to see much more of that effectively. What we do, especially regarding the FX component, but we do not see a lot of that. So if we see like at national level how much of the budget is going into these initiatives, it could be much more. So in that sense, I totally agree with your point. That would be really relevant because again, I think especially the wash sector is considered one which is very much, it's almost like a public good now. So one would expect more public financing going into that. We do not see that a lot right now at local level, which is that we use the funds that are available somehow. These are unfortunately international ones right now.
And then the other challenges that Danny, you were mentioning before about how important is that those investors that are coming from outside that actually trust you because you do know the local context, right? You know your.
Yeah, exactly. So that's actually what we look for in a partner. Or in an investor is someone who could, has their mandate from outside of the country, but then we also look to see what type of presence they have within the country. That's extremely important for us so they can also help from the local context and really be able to provide a lot of that technical assistance because they also bring a certain knowledge to the table. And I think one thing that I always appreciate in partners and investors is the non-financial support that they can add. That's extremely important to us because finances are finances, but that non-financial support is what kind of what we've seen the most success in.
Thank you, Danny. There was another question there, and there.
Morning. Morning. Carlos Aguilar from Azul Source Capital, which is a fund established by Catholic Relief Services and the Inter-American Development Bank. We have faced the challenges that you describe, finding ways to hedge currency exchange risk as we scale up our initiative across Central America. So far, we have been successful at raising capital for the fund to on-lend to water services providers. So there's definitely and clearly an appetite from impact investors in this space. Where we have now an important challenge is to continue our project development work and finding the grant donors that can contribute to the philanthropic money that Catholic Relief Services provides to this project development. So my question is how you as investors can accompany this process of also finding the grant money to develop the projects and not only be part of the capital stack, but come with at least a bit of contribution in terms of grant money for this long lead project development.
Thank you, Carlos. Sinisa, you wanted to, or Barbara, you wanted to add to that?
Well, I can start, first of all, I truly believe, that, well, when you give a grant money and when you give, a free money, that's not the way to do the in sustainable manner, actually, any kind of business, including water and sanitation. So if I heard correctly, you have already the pipeline, you have already the funds that are working. It's even better from my perspective, actually, to blend with institutional money. Of course, the public money is needed to support that one, but we need to stay away from, looking for the cheap money. The cheap money goes to the venture capital, to something that is very high risk. If you already have a project and companies that are viable and commercially viable to be financed, there is a room for them actually to step into the real market. Now, that's the case. What I'm seeing currently, that majority of those projects are not commercially viable yet, and that's why we need to blend our efforts together to bring them to that scale.
Thank you, Sinisa. And Barbara, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in here briefly because I think we're talking about the whole issue of investment in foreign exchange, and it makes, and I think it was mentioned by one of the speakers earlier, it puts the developing countries significantly at risk. And I think we do need to recognize in this conversation, and this is at the level of government rather than at the level of individual sort of private investors or private entrepreneurs, that we are talking about a situation in which indebtedness of developing countries has actually gone up over the past couple of years. We're talking about many water sectors that are highly indebted and extremely vulnerable as a result of that. And we do need, I'm not a financier, and I know that there are a number of international investors who are looking very hard at how to make loans available in domestic currency. I do think that it's a critical issue that actually has to be addressed, because I think we are putting developing countries in ongoing risk around the indebtedness, and we all know that in paying off those debts, that is money that is going out of the sector and into offshore, and it's an issue that really does need to be addressed.
Thank you, Barbara. And just because we're moving towards the second part of the panel discussion now, we talk a lot about the challenges, and I know there's other questions there, but we'll take them right away. I think we provided a maybe a really difficult, good picture of what the challenges are, but I know you already are examples of things that are happening there, of tools or mechanisms that are available there. And I've heard also throughout the different challenges on how we are highlighting the importance of coming together, aligning, and then finding ways to solve this as a group of different actors. So I want to now go back to you and ask you, how do we scale up? We're here. And we talk always about the gap, the financial gap, the trillions, but it's also a service gap. And just going back what Barbara was saying and Sinisa, we're talking about financing a human right, but also we don't want to finance inefficiency. What can we do towards the future? What are those tools there? And how do we come together to scale that up? I'll start with you, Cayetan.
Yeah, thank you. So one is building a track record. And when we came, not 12 years ago, but years ago to CEDA to pitch our proposition with Take a Stake, luckily enough, they found it interesting and important, but they also asked, okay, show us where it was done before. So we went out and we couldn't find anything but a reference, only similar things. And this is where we were unable to get started and scoping and proof pointing and experimenting and learning and building this track record along the way. But there are no silver bullets here. So it's also already mentioned here, we need aligned action. Various stakeholders are involved, can support or can disrupt. So we need line. And I believe there's some, to put it lightly, space for optimization, also in the water sector. And just, so what one thing we can do is to help companies with pre-investment and also post-investment capacity building, like for Spouts, also learning from them, and also to engage them, south to south, north to south learning. So that's one thing. And also to help and to check and to help in various ways, not only in business development, but also to make sure that the products and services are adequate, quality control, and Spouts is really a front runner and very picky also about it. So this is also where we can learn from. We have got our ESG screening in place, which is also part of the scaling, because at the end it's a reputation, a branding, and also a risk. So we want to get out with good companies. But it's also on the financial institutions. We have got here Cardano, which is also a front runner, but there are many more out there, and we need many more out there. And that's also referring to my other speakers here, how to get them involved in a good way. But it's not only the new money, it's also the existing money, public and private, which can be reallocated or used in a smarter way to public-private funding, less disruptive, more catalytic. So there's much, much more to gain over there, building out what we have, and this needs to work better. Then it's also the public sector, enabling environment, regulatory framework, what's out there, but it's not working adequately, what needs to be added on it. So that's it. We can have got a 1-week workshop on this one, actually on all topics. And then last not least, the sector, so us, which are multi-stakeholders, but we also have got the NGOs, we have got communities, we have got all kind of other stakeholders, which are also important. What I've heard here is like the most important stakeholder when it comes to water in decision making is if a farmer is putting on his well or not, and how much water he's expecting. So this is where the power is. So yeah, it's not an easy task, but it's required to pull our forces together, and that each stakeholder is contributing to its best efforts, but also to be aligned and collaborate. And with Take a Stake, we are setting a humble example of having already a consortium of social business with a 10-year track record investing in the SMEs, or starting to invest also in WASH. CEDA, IKEA, Social Entrepreneurship, IKEA Foundation also. We are looking for more partners. That's also my pitch to you. And so please join here.
Thank you, Gaetan. And on that, maybe I'll look at, you wanted to, yeah, yes, please, to
add something. So, yeah, it's just the track record. And what I've heard a lot at this conference is, in order for us to achieve SDG 6 is going to be a lot of collaboration as well. Like, we're one story, but there's so many other stories like Spouts. So just sharing that knowledge, whether it's in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, or in Africa, right? I think sharing that knowledge is key, because there are a lot of different aspects or components about a social enterprise, especially in the WASH space, that can really help scale other solutions from around the world. You have now carbon credits, climate financing becoming a piece in this. You have some certain microfinancing schemes or services that we can provide that can also work in other areas. So I think sharing that knowledge and having collaboration is key in us achieving SDG 6.
Thank you, Daniel. And that's when you bring not just an idea, you build a portfolio of evidence. You can show those that will help you to scale up. And I'm looking at you, David, because I want to ask you, with all these conditions sort of that the other speakers have framed in terms of addressing and de-risking the providing of financing to service providers in WASH, is there like a perfect vehicle you can structure as a fund manager?
Yeah, the commercial answer is yes, it's Take a Stake. But no, I think And I think the speakers have alluded to that already. We come back to that point that we are looking at a quite nascent sector still. So everybody's learning, and we are not looking at an oiled machine yet. So basically, if you look at investing, you need two things. You need investors that give capital, and you need entrepreneurs like Daniel, where you can actually invest the capital. And on both sides, we are still looking at a sector that has a way to go. And that is where we need to team up, like Kaitan said. So on the investor side, it's still the question about the risk, the perceived risk, so risk return. How can we de-risk? How can we collaborate also in information sharing on what does it mean to invest into this sector? We had an interesting discussion yesterday with SIDA around giving guarantees, and that at the end, guarantees, it's backed by the treasury of a country. So the treasury will need to assess risks when it comes to giving a guarantee. So assessing risk on a limited track record is difficult. So that means that we need to team up, and as an industry, we need to share information about what does it mean to take risks in that sector. So this is I think, from the investor's perspective, what we need to do. From an entrepreneur perspective, and Kaitan alluded to that is teaming up on how to build more diversified deal flow. And I like the comment about the services. We're also looking into that. If there were these companies, we would invest into them. So that is where you guys as foundations play a role. That is, you come in and you can provide grants where they really need it. That is where technical assistance facilities, investment readiness programs, acceleration programs are needed to diversify the deal flow. So there is, to come back to your point, Carolina, there's no one size fits it all. We need a consortium. So it's a very multifaceted problem, which is sitting on both sides, as I mentioned it. So we need a consortium that includes the private sector, that includes the public sector, and so on. When we look at the needs of the entrepreneurs, like Daniel, they need patient investors, patient capital investors, and investors that are flexible. So that means there's not one instrument that you can put forward. So equity is needed, debt is needed. You need to be flexible on the terms. Every business model is a bit different. And every business model is trying to figure out what is the best mix, I would say, to grow. So we need to be patient, and we need to be flexible on that thing. And then, again, we need guarantees and TA facility. So from pure structuring perspective, I think you can structure whatever you need somehow, but you need to know what you want to structure. And that is the challenge. And that's what we are trying with Take a Stake to put forward. It's a consortium that attacks the problem from different angles, from the deal flow angle, from the risk angle, from the assessment angle, data evidence building angle, and teamwork makes the dream work, I would say, in that sense, very much.
Thank you, David. And then with that, I would like to go to Perinar and Martin, both of you. As public sector, and we talk about all this collaboration and the consortium, what would you like to see more from others like you, other agencies, other potential partners? What are they not doing? Because you're doing something. How can you also join this alliance or movement for unlocking capital for WASH?
Most important is to listen and learn. I mean, we are leaving our comfort zone and our traditional, let's call it added value or whatever, from a competence point of view. So you have to start off with listening and learning, but then try to translate that in some kind of action, or at least acting as a constructive partner in one or the other way, which may not necessarily mean financing. It can be other roles. We all have brands. We got good names. So there are very many ways we can do this. But we have to be a bit brave, because it's not easy. When we sit here, I'm a simple desk officer. It sounds very easy. I'm playing around with words, but when you get into the nitty-gritties, it's tricky. It takes years. It can take 5-6 years, and on year 6, you see no deal of one or the other reason. Maybe the National Debt Office said we cannot calculate the risk. Sorry, it's a no-go. And that's the end of the story. So you have to be a bit brave and leave your zone of comfort and try to understand and dare to partner up with folks you may not necessarily have worked with before.
And get your word out there, right? All these learnings that you have, share that. So maybe the others can feel less scared to do the jump. Martin.
Yeah. So we started with going from the millions to the billions to the trillions. And my sense is that, there are great examples of entrepreneurs who make it. I think that is sort of the pick the winners dynamics. And you get from maybe the thousands or the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands to the millions. But I don't see the billions in sight there yet. I think the private sector is very focused. They are really clear about why they are on Earth. And so is the finance sector, I think. I think governments are really struggling with, what the heck are we doing? I mean, what is our mission? Okay, so our mission is eradicate poverty, but, actually, or is our mission to de-risk? We could maybe farm out poverty eradication to the private sector, and if we de-risk them, then they will do it, yeah? Is that how it's gonna happen? So I think we are quite confused, and I would say governments really need to get their act together. I mean, the question of Lewis about private sector service provision, I've seen examples in countries where, we have, small town private sector service provision. And I mean, I know a country where, in my view, it's a very complicated system to pay an operator a decent salary because the public sector cannot pay decent salaries. A country like Mozambique has this delegated framework. And the idea is that the private operators are going to send operating fees to the capital, and that secures the financial autonomy of the central agency, and that allows them to pay better salaries. At the end of the day, the private operator in the small town cannot meet, doesn't have enough customers, sends the bill to the capital, and the capital pays the deficit. So, it's a very complex system to pay a local operator a decent salary. And because the prospect is there that at some day in the distant future, those private operators will all pay their fees to the capital. That's why the central agency has now claimed we are financially autonomous. In 12 years, not a penny has flown from the decentral to the central, but still they have autonomous status, and now they can also pay more decent salaries. So I think, guys, how complex are we making this? You could also solve this publicly, because private sector, I think, works from the top. There's a credit-worthy, bankable group, and you try to deepen that. I mean, you don't start at the bottom, but you get stuck with a big group at the bottom that's where the billions are. So I think we also have to rethink public sector options. I'm not sure that the private sector is going to fix the bottom.
And complexity also scares the private sector. When the rules are a bit too entangled and you don't have a clear, set of responsibilities, that's a big, but Sinisa, you talk also about billions, no? I think that's not a rare number for the way you work too. So what's your view on this?
Well,
what do you need? Who else? Because the panel here is talking a lot about collaboration and the role that everybody needs to play, and the important changes that the public sector has to have. Are there opportunities there for those billions that you manage?
Well, by default, I'm optimist and truly believe that that's the case. I think looking today in this actually panel. You brought together all relevant parties. You have the one that's running the show, SMEs. You brought SIDA, the Dutch representatives as well, and also certain investors. So it's possible. Talking and speaking together today, we are opening these ways for the way forward. Is it easy? No, it's not an easy. As mentioned earlier, it requires this structure. It requires understanding the risk. It requires, putting all these elements of puzzle together and collaborating very actively. On our end, in order to set up a fund of a billions or something like that, especially when you need actually local partners, we need to partner with them. We need to learn from them, but they also need to learn from us. I think that channel needs to open as soon as possible. We need to share our experience. I need to share what I do expect and how I think that can be done. However, I need definitely sports to tell me, look, guys, this is not the way how it works in Uganda. Maybe it works in India, but not in Uganda. So I truly believe that sharing this information and bringing the right people together, like-minded people, will bring us actually to the next step. Now, it's not an easy, and Kajata mentioned it took him 10 years. And I started, 15 years ago, actually looking into water and sanitation financing from the emerging countries. And we are, after 15 years, setting up a fund. It took us a decade actually to put all these elements together. However, thanks to the ways, to the finish, yes, it's possible to bring all, because we all have the same goal. We have the goal to provide the water and sanitation to those people. And now some of them will be financed publicly, or they need a technical assistance that can be funded by grants. But there are also the ways and actually need for the capital private investments in the sector. So I believe we need to continue these discussions, and we would like to invite all of you, alongside to this water week, to get together, on separate actually occasion and to talk about, the way forward. At least I can share my experience and willing to share that with you.
Thank you, Sinisa. The conversation is going to have to keep going offline, but before we close, because there's so much to say, Barbara, you are the leading person in a network that talks about integrity. So how do we make collaboration in this very complex setting happen?
Thanks very much, Carolina, and I'll try to be quick. Can I just say that I'm absolutely with Martin. I think that the billions are actually sitting in public finance, in tariffs, and that there's a great deal of work that needs to be done to get the public sector to get their act together to actually find the billions that are needed to meet SDG 6. Having said that, there is a role for the private sector. I'm probably more of a realist than Sinisa, who says he's an optimist. I'm looking at how much is coming in the blended finance into the water sector currently. About over the past couple of years, about 2% of the blended finance is going into the water sector. I don't think the water sector is a particularly sexy return on investment for people. I think it's considered a high-risk area, and I don't think that we're going to see the billions coming from the private sector. But I do think that the private sector is playing a role. And in relation to that, I think from an integrity perspective, there are two things that I would kind of ask for people to think about. Those that are actually involved in trying to mobilize private sector finance and drive private sector finance for the delivery of water services. The provision of goods is a different issue, but for the actual delivery of water services, there are two things that I'd like people to think about. How can the work that you do contribute to building the regulatory capacity in the countries that you're working in order to ensure that there is effective regulation of water services provision, whether it's through local government or it's through the private sector or it's through NGOs, whoever it is. How on earth can we build the regulatory capacity to protect the water users, the customers, in relation to the quality of the service provided and in relation to the price? So I would challenge people to think about the regulatory implications of what they were doing. And very closely linked to that is how, and I know this isn't what you would normally think about as investors and people trying to mobilize investment around your work, but how do we support civil society to exercise social accountability? We are facing a world in which civic space is closing. The power of civil society is under significant threat. In terms of integrity and accountability, the role of civil society is absolutely non-negotiable. I was just very quickly heard last week about a road project in Kenya where the local community actually deployed 2 elders to go and sit. They took chairs to the road construction and they sat there and they watched what was happening all day. And the road was actually constructed under time and well under budget, simply because there were people watching. How can the work that we are doing in the private sector think a little bit out the box, how this can actually enable support from for civil society and social accountability as well? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara and Sinisa. And I think that's a really good note. Well, I work with regulators for many years. I think that's the next topic for the next Water Week. But I think you brought that that flavor of the local context. So what worked in Kenya, that's because they knew their communities and they knew how they feel and how they can contribute to this collaboration, or what we can call an alliance for unlocking SDGs. Last 30 seconds, Daniel, and 30 seconds, Samson, before we close, and then we can keep the conversation. But I think our friends from the technical team are going to ask us to stop on time. Daniel, any last word?
Thank you. I feel that maybe we need to open up the sector, the water sector, to areas that are private sector viable for intervention. That means changing policies and our legislation to remove this cage that we've put around the water sector as a public a good or a right, so that certain aspects of the components that should be done by private sector can be opened up, and then we collaborate with the chambers of commerce and other entities to ensure that these opportunities are shared, and we develop that evidence for private sector involvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Alanson.
I'll be very short. I mean, it's great to be in this room. I think all the right stakeholders are here. And then the funding is also there. I mean, I think one thing I would just like to stress before this is one of the last sessions at World Water Week, is just the sense of urgency. That's actually our value as a company, the very first value. And the problem is only going to get bigger. And I think the right stakeholders in the room, we should all have that sense of urgency to make that difference in a sustainable way. And I strongly believe that we can do that. And then would love to connect with others, other entrepreneurs as well, and how we can achieve that.
Thank you. Last question, last comment, and then we close.
Thank you. Henk Holslag from Metameter, Netherlands. I have an observation rather than a question. We all know 80% of the SDG target group lives in rural areas. Now we see there are two options to reduce cost and to get funding. One is using locally produced technologies can reduce the cost of water supply by 50% or more. What we need is funding for large-scale capacity building, large-scale South-South knowledge exchange. That is one. The second is there is a huge opportunity for funding from farmers. Most of the people in the rural areas live in areas without basic service. We can co-fund farmers, and I give you an example. In Zambia, an NGO funds farm wells, co-funds farm wells. Each well serves 40 people. The pumps, 90% of the pumps are functioning because people make money with the water. And so we reach the SDG 6 by funding farm wells. So that is a huge opportunity for funding. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And on that note, I want to wrap up. And well, I've learned so much today talking with you, Sinisa, Barbara. Thank you so much for joining the discussion, and everybody in the floor. But I think what we learned today is that we are unlocking financing. It is possible. There are entrepreneurs there like Daniel. You've shown us some examples, and there are more. We talk a little bit today about the urban setting, but there's also the urban, the disconnected, the non-sewered services too. And so I think there's a call. I think that's what I want to take home. There's a call from different actors to come together, collaborate, and take this, scale it up, accelerate, right, to the trillions that we want to reach. So we will be around, the speakers will be around. Please connect, keep this conversation going, and hopefully I'll see you the next World Water Week or before. Thank you, everybody.